Welcome, everyone. So I know many of you, and also there are lots of you I don't know, and lots of you, many of my appearances are not Denison students, so I'm really glad the word got out in the community. If you don't know me, I'm Dr. May. I teach in the Department of Mathematics and Computer Science, and I am just thrilled to be able to introduce Dr. Duchess Harris. I met her last summer at a Woodrow Wilson Career Enhancement Fellowship retreat, and she was just this amazing speaker that whatever she spoke, you're like, it's so true, and then it's so profound, and I'm like, I'm just picking up what you're putting down. And then I found out about her background with the story, and I'm like, I have to have you out to Denison. I need to share this with as many people as possible. So thank you for the generous support of the Lawrence E. Harris and Rodenberg funds, and for all of you for coming. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Duchess Harris. She is the granddaughter of Miriam Daniel Mann, who was a human computer at NASA from 1943 to 1966. Duchess's mother, Miriam Mann Harris, raised her to be fearless like her grandmother. Dr. Harris is a professor and chair of American Studies at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. In addition to Hidden Human Computers, the Black Women of NASA, Harris also co-authored Black Lives Matter with Sue Bradford Edwards. Other publications include Black Feminist Politics from Kennedy to Obama, and a co-edited volume with Bruce Baum, Racially Writing of Republic, Racists, Race Rebels, and Transformations of American Identity. On September 1st, 2017, Harris's fifth book, Race and Policing, which we have a talk about tomorrow at 4:30 in Higley, with Rebecca Richmond, was released. So please join me in welcoming Duchess Harris.
Thank you, Dr. May. Let's see, can you hear me? Okay, so what she didn't say was that she inspired me. She was the rising star. I was like, oh, look what Denison has. I was delighted to be invited here, and that was very generous. I actually thought we were just on vacation, like doing a little, peer mentoring. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about my book, Hidden Human Computers, The Black Women of NASA. And I'm just wondering, a little show of hands, how many of you all have seen the movie Hidden Figures? Oh, a few. Okay, that's pretty good, that's pretty good. Well, to get us into the spirit of tonight's presentation, I thought I would open up with a short clip. It's about a minute and a half. It's one of my favorite scenes in the movie, and it'll just get us started. So most of you all know that that was Taraji Henson playing Katherine Johnson, who is the only living human computer of the second set of computers. I'm going to talk about the computers before that. She's 99 years old. And if you had not heard of this story before the movie, you would think that this is a civil rights story. The movie takes place in 1961 and 1962 at the Langley NASA, which is in Hampton, Virginia. What I happen to know is that this is not a civil rights story. This is a World War II story. And the way that I know that is because this is an image of my maternal grandmother, Miriam Daniel Mann. And my grandmother was in the first entering class of Black women who were allowed to work at NASA. There were 11 of them, and that happened in 1943. And so that's 20 years before what you're learning about what happened in the movie. My grandmother actually worked with all of the women in the movie. So as you know, other than Katherine Johnson, you have Octavia Spencer playing Dorothy Vaughan. You have Janelle Monáe playing Mary Jackson. And my family has rich stories about all of them. In fact, my mother, who's still alive, who's 81 years old, admits now that she had her high school graduation party at Mary Jackson's house, and they were so ruckus they were asked to leave. She would not have told me that 15 years ago, but now that I have teenagers, she shares that, and she's like, good luck with your journey. So, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my grandmother. She was born in 1907 in Covington, Georgia. She was fortunate enough to go to Talladega College, which was in Alabama. It's a historically black college. She got a 4-year degree in chemistry. Now, when she graduated with her chemistry degree, she did what any respectable young woman would do when they finished college at the time, which is go home and live with her parents. Her plan was to teach high school chemistry, but life got in the way. She met a young man who ended up becoming my grandfather. And so my grandfather was William Mann, and he was from, his hometown was Hampton, Virginia. They're meeting in Georgia. He says to her, "Will you marry me and go back to my hometown of Hampton? I've been offered a faculty position at Hampton Institute." Now, this was very prestigious because even though Hampton Institute was a historically black college, one of the things I talk about in my book is that historically black colleges were launched by the federal government with the Freedmen's Bureau, and they were basically run by white Americans, both administratively and on the faculty. So the fact that he was African American and had this opportunity to teach at Hampton was critically important. They end up in this space, and it's important that they're in this space because it's less than 10 miles from the NASA that's in town. And so I'll end up weaving a narrative for you of how she ends up working in that space after she starts raising her family at Hampton. So I've known this story my whole life, but I was a typical young person where your parents tell you things and you don't listen to them because you don't think it's important. And so it wasn't until I got to college that this story started having meaning for me. I was a history major as an undergraduate, and when I was in my college class and started thinking about what it meant for someone to have been born in 1907 as a black woman to go to college, I realized that that was only 60 years after slavery ended. And so once I decided to become an academic, I said, I'm going to write this book. Now, it was not the dissertation, it was not the tenure book, it was the post-tenure sabbatical book. And so I recommend to a lot of you all, your passion sometimes has to come after tenure. So, just a little career advice, right? Like at Woodrow Wilson. So, in the summer of 2014, I took one of my former students with me to visit the NASA Langley. This student and I applied with Margot Lee Shetterly for a Virginia Humanities Foundation grant. If that name sounds familiar to you, Margot Shetterly, she wrote the Hidden Figures book. She's trained as a journalist. She wanted to write a book that was for adults and for popular audiences. I wanted to write a book for young people that included a curriculum. The way that we collaborated on the grant was that I had college letterhead and a student. She was able to get us access into NASA because her father was one of the first black engineers to work there in the 1970s, right? So it was a coming together that was exactly what we both needed for what we wanted to do. So when we got to the grounds of NASA, it was critical that we were actually in the spatial location of where this story happened because it made it so real for us. So a perfect example, since most of you all have seen the movie, is in the movie you see Katherine Johnson running between buildings, and in the movie they say that the buildings are half a mile apart. That's actually not true. They're further apart than that. Okay? And so it's not until you are on the grounds of NASA that you see what the distance is between the west area, which is where the black women are located, and the east area where most of the work is happening. And so when I'm in Minnesota and I talk about this, the reference point that I make is that if you haven't been to a NASA, it's like a Mayo Clinic. You can drive between those buildings. And so I also got access to the archives, which was critical. And I always just like to show this slide because I feel like the historic preservation officer needs to be celebrated. This is the kind of career that people have that's quiet, people don't know what they do, but it's critical because so many people have been asking in the last calendar year, why didn't we know this story? We didn't know this story because we didn't have access to the material. It's not that it didn't happen, we didn't have the documents, and it isn't until people like this are able to release this information that we can, make this, a living document. And so when we got into the archives, people often ask me, what was the one piece of paper you touched that really changed you? It was this. This is the deed to the land to NASA, which shows that it was built on Chesterville Plantation. Now, if you know anything about Southern history, and I like to think I know a little bit about Southern history because I have a job, right? This intellectually wasn't surprising. Emotionally, however, I had to stop and pause and say, what does this mean? And so it posed the research question, which was, is it possible that the descendants of formerly enslaved Africans on this plantation, could they possibly become NASA employees? The answer to that is, but of course, right? And one of the reasons why that would be is that I think of my grandfather, who ends up becoming this professor at Hampton. His side of the family came from the Spotswood plantation. Spotswood was the first lieutenant governor of Virginia. And so that's how all these things come together. Now, if you look at the document, this is the 1973 version, and I think I saw someone pointing to it. They're like, oh, I see what they're doing here. So it's typewritten in. There was a time when there were typewriters. Work with me, young people, right? So it's typewritten in Chesterville Plantation. It's handwritten in Chesterville Site Preferred, right? Which somehow, if we call it a site, it's not a plantation, okay? That's, those are like the new facts, right? Is that these alternative facts? Is that what we're doing? And so, but that's like critical, because without this, how do you write this book? So this is the jacket cover of my book. And the woman who's on the cover of the book is actually not my grandmother. This woman is Melba Roy Moten, and she was at the Goddard NASA, which is in Maryland. And we chose this image because it shows the human computer standing next to that newfangled technology that was called the IBM, right? That people didn't understand it. It took up the whole row of a wall, and people were afraid. The human computers were afraid that they would be replaced, they would become obsolete, and that they would no longer be needed now that there were these machine computers. And so one of the things that we're trying to convey in that image is the tension between the human computer and the machine computer, which leads to teaching this book to young people, and the first question they're going to ask is, what in the world is a human computer? Right? And so one of the things that has humbled me the most in life is having my own kids. I don't know what I was thinking, right? Because they always tell me I'm wrong and what I'm doing isn't interesting. And so their first thing is just like, well, how is there a world without computers? And I'm like, I don't know how to explain this, but there used to be human beings that did these calculations. And so what this was a gendered profession. This was women checking the math of engineers because only men could be engineers. That's what human computers were. That's what they did. It was a profession that started in the early 1900s. Because it was in the early 1900s, originally, the women would have had to have been white. Okay? Historically, that just makes all the sense in the world. Now, the follow-up question then would be, well, how do black women become human computers? Basically, how in the world could you get enough education to be able to do this kind of work, given how much black people have been locked out of education? This is where I made the choice when I was writing my book to explain what historically black colleges are. And so my family, 6 generations have gone to Hampton. My grandparents are buried on the campus of Hampton, right? I have a side of the family that doesn't understand how I couldn't have possibly gone to Hampton. All because I just like doing things differently. But I was never confused about what a historically black college was. I've been teaching in Minnesota for more than 20 years, where people have either not heard of them or they think they used to exist. And so one of the things we explain is that there are actually 3 historically black colleges that came about before even emancipation, because they were in Ohio and Pennsylvania, which were not slave states. And so you get Cheney, Lincoln, and Wilberforce. Now, once emancipation happens, you get the establishment of what is now called Hampton University. At the time, it was called Hampton Institute. On this slide is an image of Hampton's most famous alum. Now, I'm not going to call on anyone. I just want to see a show of hands. Does anyone recognize this man? I just love this. Oh my gosh, you guys are like the most educated group I've seen in a minute. Really. So I'm all warm and fuzzy. This is Mr. Booker T. Washington. Okay? Mr. Booker T. Washington was born enslaved, and the slave master was his biological father. He lived in slavery until he was 11, and that was in West Virginia. He walked from West Virginia to attend Hampton. Now, he didn't go for higher education. That really wasn't what he was able to pursue. So if you read his autobiography, Up From Slavery, he says the first thing that they taught him at Hampton was how to brush his teeth. And he's 11. Because he'd been enslaved, and in that context, slaves don't brush their teeth. The second thing he was taught was how to make a bed. He'd never slept in one. And so he's so deeply moved by this notion of education as liberation, because he starts from there and then goes as far into book learning as they can possibly offer at the time, that Booker T. Washington is the founder of Tuskegee University. And so, this is, the critical notion of how you get this population to answer this question of how do you get these employees at NASA. Now, Booker T. Washington's project at Tuskegee in many ways was for black men to be critical to bricklaying. There was the notion that if black men were involved in physical manual labor, they would be economically indispensable in the South. This meant that black women were really not cut out of book learning, right? Because I get the question all the time, how are they impacted by sexism? At this particular moment, you have a population of 4 million who've not only been illiterate, but it's against the law for them to read and write. So when you have black women that want to study law or teaching, this slide says medicine, it really means midwifery, right? They weren't necessarily discouraged because the community needed to be lifted up and they were going to be living in segregation. And so this gives you an opportunity for black women to actually learn science. And so this is an image of Cylongage, who ends up being the head of the Department of Natural Sciences at Lincoln University as early as 1888. Now, if you know your American history, that's only 20 years after emancipation. And so, by no stretch of the imagination is she the norm, right? Clearly, she's a trailblazer, she's the vanguard, she's pretty much on her own. But this is the beginning of how you see a population growing into this knowledge. Now, the other part of the book has to deal with what is the history of NASA, right? What was their project? How did they come about? And so the first thing is that NASA wasn't always NASA. Originally, it was NACA. So it was the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. And the reason for that was the technology at the time was planes. That was the level of advancement. It's 1915. It's also important to understand what the political moment is in 1915, which is that Woodrow Wilson is president. And the reason why I bring that up is because Woodrow Wilson was a segregationist and never had any notions that a place like NACA would be desegregated. However, if you fast forward from World War I to World War II, and for historians in the room, I know lots of things happened in between, right? Because it's like, stop, wait a minute, important things happened, I get that. But if we fast forward, the president during World War II is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR is experiencing a lot of pressure during his presidency that's both global and domestic. Globally, we're going off to war, okay? Domestically, African American men are profoundly frustrated with their lack of employment opportunities. So at the time, unions are segregated. There was a union organizer named A. Philip Randolph who was profoundly respected by different civil rights leaders that might not have gotten along with each other, but they respected Mr. Randolph. And so Mr. Randolph contacts FDR and says, we want to have a march on Washington for jobs and freedom. Now, that sounds familiar. It happens 20 years later. However, FDR says, oh my gosh, not on my watch. Like, no way, no how. I don't want a bunch of black men hanging out on the national lawn, and we're at war. Make it stop. And so they said, well, we're not going to not come and you don't give us something. And so they broker a deal, and FDR says, I'm going to sign Executive Order 8802. This will desegregate federal jobs. Okay? So this is an important moment. This is a moment where it all comes together for someone like my grandmother. Because what you have is that the majority of the employees at NACA are white men. They're deployed to war. And then federal jobs are desegregated. So what you have then is this entering class. So here they are. These are the first 11 black women to work at NASA. Now, this is a newspaper clipping from the Norfolk, Virginia Journal and Times, which was the black newspaper. Now, people ask all the time, how could people have not known this story? We're so segregated that white people have never seen this newspaper, right? Black people knew this was happening. Not only that, if you go back to the movie and the church scene and they're celebrating the women, but people don't worship together, right? So the whole black community is fully aware that this is going on and white people are completely clueless. So if you had done some kind of interviews at the time and had said to the white employees of NACA, do black people work here? If it wasn't some kind of, cafeteria or janitorial role, they would have said, of course not. They wouldn't have been lying. They never would have seen them. Okay, and I'll explain how that happened. So the title of the article says, Paving the Way for Women Engineers. That actually is aspirational. This group of women do not become engineers. All of these women remain computers. If you go back to the movie, the first engineers don't come along until Dorothy Vaughan ends up teaching herself Fortran and Mary Jackson ends up getting further education. That's into the early 1960s. My grandmother worked there until 1966. She actually worked with Dorothy Vaughan and helped train her. And so these women were put in the West area, as I mentioned before. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. And so this was both an opportunity of privilege, but also struggle. So the privilege, first and foremost, is like, who could even wrap their heads around the fact that black women could work at NACA, right? People couldn't do that last year before the movie, right? So, I mean, just the fact that they were there was mind-blowing. One of the things that was kind of a disadvantage was that the junior engineers made $2,600 a year. The black women made $1,400 a year. Now, first of all, we all know that still happens, right? Now, the other thing that's complicated about that is how much $1,400 a year was in the black community. The second highest paying job that a black woman could get at the time would be to be a school teacher. Now, you have to do the numbers here. How many school teaching positions were there? There weren't that many positions. They made $500 a year. If you pull up the census data, more than 90% of black women at the time were domestics. Now, what did domestics make? Nowhere near $500 a year. Whatever they made it when their families felt like paying them. It's not like that was regulated, right? And so this ends up not creating a black middle class. This is actually the black elite. And the reason why I make the distinction is because you could purchase a single family home at this time for $3,600. Okay, so the black middle class might have been the father is working in the post office and the mother is teaching school. That's not the father's a faculty member at Hampton and the mother is a human computer. And the reason why I say that is that if you watch the movie, you see this as kind of like a liberation narrative for a community of people. I feel like I have to underscore that this is 11 people. Even when you get to the movie, Dorothy Vaughan says there's 20 of us. Okay, there are 14 million black people in America. So this is not a liberation narrative, right? This is an opportunity for few. All right, so once they got there, what was their experience? So my grandmother actually ate her lunch at her desk for the first 10 years that she was there. The reason why that was is you have to think that Brown versus Board of Education doesn't even happen until 1954. This is why they're hidden. They're not hidden just because it's against the social mores. It's against the law, right? So what FDR did was desegregate federal jobs. He did not desegregate spaces in the South. That doesn't happen until 11 years later. And so that's why they're in the West area, so no one knows that they're there. It also works as a code term, so if they're doing calculations and someone in the room who has enough clearance to ask who did the calculations, they'd say the West area computers, and then that person would know that those were the colored women, okay? And so it isn't until the mid-1950s that this building is modified, and this is a diagram I got from the archives, where you see in the middle it says kitchen, and then over here it says white dining room, and over here it says colored dining room. So this image is in the book, but also I want you to take note that next to the colored dining room, those are doors to the outside of the building. So the purpose is to walk across the campus, to go in and eat by yourselves, and then to leave, right? At the point where people do know that you're there, but that you're separate. So one of the things that I think that the movie did well was that it showed even after Brown versus Board of Education, you have segregation. So there's the scene in the movie where Kirsten Dunst is playing the supervisor, and she's very upset because she realizes that Mary Jackson is trying to become an engineer. And so she goes in, and they're eating in the cafeteria. If you paid attention to this, all the black women are eating by themselves. Then in the movie, the camera pans, and you see there's another room, and then there are white people eating over there. That's this, right? And that's 61, 62. And so that gives you an idea of how it was simultaneously privilege and some discrimination. So the next question would be, well, why did NACA put so much effort into keeping these women there, particularly once the war was over? You know, then the men come back, they can have these jobs. Why even bother, since it's so much work having them there and hiding them? One of the reasons is that we're such a competitive nation. And so if you remember from the movie, Kevin Costner's character, who actually really didn't exist, he was a conglomeration of people, says, how did we end up becoming, you know, the second dog in a two-dog race, right? And he's like absolutely livid that the Soviet Union has beaten us, right? They get out of space first. And so this is a moment where the nation becomes very frightened that other countries are going to be able to be outer space. They're afraid that they're going to have cameras, that they will spy on us, they will bomb us, and just that they will be superior. And so it's at this moment that in 1958, you get the National Defense Education Act passed. What that does is officially transition NACA to NASA and puts lots of money into this project so that we can be competitive in the space race. It also is at the moment where you're starting to campaign for a new presidential election for 1960, and Kennedy has at the top of his agenda that we are going to be competitive in space. And so that's how you get this movement, and that's also why you have this commitment for having these women to still be there. So one woman I want to share with you is a woman who wasn't mentioned in the movie because this woman actually worked at the Cleveland, Ohio, NACA. And so this is Annie Easley. She was born in 1933 in Birmingham, Alabama. She went to Xavier University, which is a historically black college in New Orleans. And the Cleveland NACA only had 5 black women that worked there. And so it was too small, they thought to segregate them. Also, Cleveland had a different politic. So they said, fine, you know, you can work on these integrated teams. And so just as I'm being videotaped now, you're on your job, and people, like, you know, pay attention to what you're doing. She's on her job, and they take photographs of what they're doing on the job for the company newsletter. When the photo comes back and she's in it, they decide to crop her out. And so she's very upset by that. And they say, Annie, it's the late 1950s. You know how people are. We just can't let people know that you are here. Now, what's interesting about this is that this story has a happy ending, which is that about 10 years later, she ends up being the cover of the Science and Engineering newsletter. And the reason why she ends up being on the cover is because she has the fortitude to take evening classes at Cleveland State and to learn Fortran, which of course is the programming language that you needed to have so that she could figure out what to do with the IBM and not be replaced by the IBM. So this is what Dorothy Vaughan is doing. Another one of my scenes in the movie that I love so much is that they go into the library is segregated, then they get on the bus is segregated, and they've already had the church scene, so it's set up that she's a good, God-fearing woman, and she has her sons with her, so she reaches into her purse, and she pulls out the Fortran book. So, of course, her sons are like, Mama, you stole the book. And her response is, I pay my taxes, it belongs to me as much as anyone else, right? But it's this subversive act where what she's doing is like taking charge of her career because she knows that she has to steal the knowledge to move forward. And so this is what Annie Easley's doing. She doesn't have to steal the knowledge, but Annie Easley has to pay for the knowledge. So this is something that NASA did. All of their other employees, they paid for their continuing ed. They made Annie pay her own tuition. And so, you know, it goes both ways, right? That she has the opportunity to be there, but she's going to literally have to pay the price. All right, and I just include this image. We went to press before we had this image, so it's not in the book. But I like this because this is the Centaur, which was a rocket ship. And even though I grew up with the stories of my grandmother working at NASA, I didn't have in my imagination as a young black girl that a black woman could work on a rocket ship. So I just think that is so cool. The other thing I include in my book is how these women who did math also were simultaneously involved in the civil rights movement. So Annie Easley was actually charged a poll tax when she was voting in the late 50s and early 60s. And so what they'd say to her was, well, we'll only charge you $2 because you have a 4-year degree. And so she worked on voter registration. The other thing was that she ends up becoming the first equal employment opportunity counselor that NASA ever has. And so this, coming together of both civil rights and math was not surprising to me, but I know a lot of people think of these as like separate worlds, and they don't have to be separate worlds. One thing that the movie got wrong was, if you remember, they had the colored bathrooms and Kevin Costner tore the sign down. Now, a lot of people enjoyed that scene, they clapped. I'm gonna ruin it for you, okay? So my grandmother took those signs down. And they were not huge, you do not need a crowbar. They were on the wall, you could slide them off, you could drop them in your big purse. I wonder how I know that, because I've been told this story a lot. And my uncle, who's 83, who's lucid as a tack, says that, his parents, who were my grandparents, fought about it all the time. And they fought about it all the time because my grandfather was afraid she would get caught, she would get fired, she would lose that $1,400, which was actually more than he was making because he was a professor, right? And so, that's like the real subversiveness. It doesn't work for Hollywood, right? But the truth of the matter is that they were working on math, but they didn't want to live in segregation, and they were willing to operate against segregation. So, the other thing I wanted to include in my book, which is very different than the sentiments that we have in the nation now about this project, is that if you see the movie and this is what you think to yourself, wow, black people must have really loved NASA. Okay, most black people didn't. And the huge reason for that, of course, is because most black people felt like they were locked out of that opportunity. So much so, there was a spoken word artist named Gil Scott-Heron. There are going to be like 3 people in the room old enough to know who that was. Thank you. Oh my gosh, okay. Just for that, thank you. So we get to the moon in 1969, and Gil Scott-Heron is from Chicago. And in 1970, he releases this song, and it's called Whitey on the Moon. And so I have lyrics of the song in the book, and I just want to share it with you. I want you to hear how this sounds, and I'll talk about how NASA responded to this. Okay, so I tell my students all the time, when you do research, you shouldn't make assumptions. What do I do while I'm working on this book? I assume that NASA finds out about this song and goes ballistic. I was wrong. So, what does NASA do? NASA decides to do a self-assessment and says, we've done okay with hiring people of color, but maybe we could do a little better. They hired Nichelle Nichols to be a national spokesperson for them to do recruiting at NASA. Now, I have to say, I had the opportunity to speak at the Johnson C. Space Center, the Houston NASA, back in August. I will admit, I was terrified. Because I just knew they were going to ask me some astrophysics, something I didn't understand. And I was just like, I'm just trying to write books here for 6th and 12th graders, right? I was all scared. But what was great was that it was at least 50 people in the room, all that worked for NASA. None of them knew this, right? And so I was like, look, I made a contribution, right? Now, I have to tell you why the slide is made this way. So this is what Nichelle Nichols looked like when she played Lieutenant Uhura, like back in the early 70s. This is what she looks like now. So I had to play around with this slide because depending on where you are generationally, you recognize her maybe one way or the other, or I humbly submit there are young people in the room who don't recognize her at all. In fact, I was talking at a high school and this person said, what's Star Trek? So young people, have you never heard of it? I Would Love You Anyway. Do you know what Star Trek is? You love, thank you, you did good. You did good right there. Because I was just like, for real? I was like, put your phone down. Well, let me really historicize and contextualize how important Nichelle Nichols was for pop culture at the time, because so many people don't understand this. So in the early 1970s, outside of PBS, all there was ABC, CBS, and NBC. So you're talking 3 channels. I know that right there is a lesson. That right there is a lesson. Take notes, right? So there are only 3 channels. And because of where we are with racial politics, there are only 2 black women on television. The other black woman is Diane Carroll. She plays Julia. Julia was a show about a nurse, and she was a single parent, but it was okay because she was a widow, so it's like we forgave her. And like the doctor was nice to her because she was a nurse, and she was a nurse, she wasn't a doctor, right? Like all that, and Diane Carroll's gorgeous, right? So it's like, oh, and the little boy was cute. That was Julia, and people watched Julia, right? People most certainly watched Julia. It was not Star Trek, right? Everybody watched Star Trek, and everyone was like, ooh, a black woman on Star Trek, right? And Star Trek had crazy racial politics to it. One which was every other actor on the show was paid for the entire season. Nichelle Nichols was paid by episode. And she was so upset by that, she was going to quit. And Martin Luther King called her and begged her to stay on the show. Okay, so no, this is all true facts, people, really. I know you're like, what? But like, seriously, like, I've been invited, like, I'm not gonna come up here and lie, like, true facts. And so that's like the meaning of Nichelle Nichols. So NASA knew exactly what they were doing, and they said, you know, okay, fine, we hear you, Gil Scott-Heron, Whitey on the Moon, you know, we're gonna like push past this and, you know, try to be better. One of the ways in which they found out that they actually that they were better in some ways than some other federal entities was that when FDR signed that executive order, there were federal spaces that didn't comply. They were just scared. They were like, we don't know about this whole desegregation thing. So NACA at the time was one of the first places to do it. Also, there ends up being a lot of black women at NASA because when their husbands, if they fought in war, came back, their husbands were cut out of the GI Bill. So a lot of people don't know that even though they were veterans, they were locked out of FHA loans and they weren't able to build up housing. And so in the 50s, when you have the economic boom and you get interstates built and suburbia comes up, the white women who worked at NACA were able to leave and like live in suburbia and stay home with their kids, because this is before the second wave of feminism, and that was desirable and expected. The black women couldn't afford to do that. So they were consistently there the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and 70s. Also, by the time you get to be the 70s, then you start getting the transition from computer to engineering. So they had a good base. Now, people often ask, where in the world are the black men in this? The University of Virginia doesn't allow black men to take engineering classes until 1958, and they allowed 2. However, when you get to the early 70s, that's when you get black men who are engineers. That's who Margot Lee Shetterly's dad was, okay? And so this is like the history that at this moment now, the executive director of NASA, his last name is Bolden, is African American. Right? And all this happened because of the effort that, you know, we're talking, you know, 5-6 decades. So, I want to show you this quickly because one thing that I have to celebrate from my institution is that they believed in this project several years before there was a notion of a movie. And so this is a digital archive which you can find. It's copywritten. It's a part of the library at McAllister. And they started giving me seed money for this as far back as 2013. And this just includes some primary documents. And I want to show you this document, not because it has sentimental value, but I want you to understand how it operates. And so what this is a letter on NASA letterhead thanking my grandmother for 20 years of service. It's dated in '63. Why is this significant? This is significant because when I first started applying for grant money for this project, I was denied because they said your project doesn't make any sense. There's no way that could have happened. It would have been illegal. True facts. And so when you have something like this, and you show this to the Virginia Humanities Foundation, then they're like, oh, okay, it happened. Here's a little bit of money. And so, there's like a meta-narrative there about all the different ways in which primary documents can tell a story. So I'm just about getting ready to wrap up. I have 2 more images. So I just want to share it with you. This is my favorite image from the book. I'm biased. It's because it's a family photo. So the teenager sitting on the floor is my mom, who's now 81. On each end, those are my uncles, and those are my deceased grandparents. If my grandmother were still alive, she would have turned 110 this year. And so I have 3 kids of my own. My youngest, back in the spring, was 10. He was in the 5th grade. I'm like showing him the book. I'm like, isn't this awesome? Like, these are our people. It's sepia toned. It's like, yeah, she looks bored, right? This is exactly what he does to me, right? He's like, not really. And so I was like, you know what? It had nothing to do with the value of the book. This was going for a parenting win, right? This was going for a parenting win. So I was like, okay, fine. If that doesn't grab you, I think I have something. Here you go. So, next month, there's going to be human-computer Legos, right? They're coming out November 1st in time for whatever holiday you celebrate. And this woman here with like the beige in the front, that's supposed, so over on the end, of course, is Mae Jemison, so different professions, but that right there is your human-computer Lego. So I have to say that there are many things I've done as a mom where like I've misstepped, but I want you to know this kid went to school and told his teacher, my great-grandma is a Lego. I was like, I win!